we can trace the Y chromosome back to one male Y chromosomal ancestor. That combined with the mitochondrial DNA and how similar worldwide mitochondrial DNA is compared with, in contrast, in correlation with the low genetic diversity, that's how we can conclude, okay, we came from just two people, right? Because that's why the evolutionists had to invent the hypothetical population bottleneck of, say, 10,000. I mean, do you hold to more of a 2,000 population bottleneck, or was it 10? Like, I've heard different theoretical numbers.
I don't know. I have to kind of go by what the consensus is. I've heard Francis Collins, or I read that he wrote, he thought it was about 10,000. Yeah, I would tend to trust his opinion on the matters since I'm not an expert in it. So I believe he said around 10,000. And just from other information I gather, I don't really see a problem with the low level of diversity in the human population, because we see the same thing on island populations. There's no difference. So those would go through bottlenecks, of course, speciation events on islands, and they show the same variation as we do species here on the mainland. There was a paper published pretty recently that came out. You're probably familiar with it, that showed all current, about 90% of current species kind of came into being, if you want to call it that, around 200,000 years ago.
Correct.
So based on the ones that they had studied, and they all show very similar, the same percentage of variation within groups.
I guess, and yes, I do want to probably go possibly in depth into that paper, which is good. But before we go on, I guess, that rabbit trail, when it comes to the low genetic diversity, the population bottleneck, Y chromosome atom, mitochondrially, for example, as you know, if evolution and deep time is true, over deep time, millions and millions of years, I should say, any large population like that would most certainly accumulate massive numbers of mutations. And then that would result in, of course, basic genetics would tell us enormous amounts of genetic diversity. So as I was saying earlier, that's a pretty serious problem for evolutionary theory, because what we now know about mankind is that we have, as a human species, very limited genetic variation, right? So then the evolutionists came up with the evolutionary out of Africa bottleneck theory, right? So for us, obviously, if we came from just two people, that means limited diversity is easy to explain. It's exactly what we would expect. But when it comes to the evolutionary model, that near extinction event, I would agree, yes, it's going to reduce homogeneity. So that is a feasible way to explain the low genetic diversity. But the problem is, Aaron, is that it would cause permanent and severe genetic damage, right? That just means, because these enormous numbers of deleterious mutations that are accumulating due to the inbreeding, they would then go to fixation. So my question is pretty simple. I'll say it like this, or I'll ask it like this. How could such a tiny, nearly extinct, of course, they'd be genetically compromised due to the inbreeding, how could that population of, say, 10,000, like you said, we can hold to Francis Collins' view on that, how could they suddenly explode in all parts of the planet and seize dominion over the entire world, being so genetically compromised? Aaron, take your time.
You kind of got the order of things kind of backwards. Like we didn't come up with the out of Africa theory or like a bottleneck from the Toba eruption or something because to explain the genetic diversity among humans. I mean, that stuff was already established years ago through paleontology, fossil record, and also tracing the history of languages, language development. And you can make phylogenetic, if you are, similar trees just based on language that align with the trees made from the fossil record. So the chances of all of those lineages lining up seems like pretty good evidence to me. Like our current understanding is correct. And you asked about.
Well, real quick before, because I want to clarify. Are you saying that they came up with the out of Africa, the hypothetical population bottleneck, after they discovered that as a human population we have limited genetic diversity? Is that your position?
No, we've known about that before we were able to get the genetic data came out, and the genetic data just confirms what we already hypothesized and already knew from the evidence.
Well, from my understanding, because I believe it was Dr. Cy Gart, and I'd have to just double check, the evidence for the population bottleneck comes from genetics, because mankind in general has such significant low genetic diversity, right? In mitochondrial DNA as well, and Y chromosome. So therefore, to explain such limited homogeneity, they concocted the story of the out of Africa population bottleneck, because there's actually multiple theories, right? There's the multi-regional theory, but there's the out of Africa theory. So
it's not concocted. Like, we look at evidence and we see what that evidence seems to tell us.
right.
And then we try and kind of deduce, hypothetical deductive models to kind of deduce what could have caused the, things we're seeing. Like, maybe there was some sort of catastrophic event that occurred around this same time period that matches the rates of mutations that we see that cause a bottleneck. And then if we find something like that, like this volcanic eruption, then that will help support our hypothesis even more. So it's kind of like with the chromosome number 2, we predicted that in advance. And then now it's not disputed at all anymore that chromosome number 2 was the result of the head-to-head fusion of two chromosomes that remain separate in the great apes.
Apologize, just a clarification. What did you say Sygart was talking about?
Sygart it was during my debate with Erica. We were going over this same problem, and I asked Erica, how they came up with this population bottleneck, and I believe it was Sygart in the comment section who was stating that it's in our genetics where they come up with the population bottleneck of 10,000, some say 2,000, because that's the only feasible way they're going to be able to explain the limited homogeneity that we have as a human species. Because as I explained earlier, if evolution is true, well, we should have enormous amounts of genetic diversity, because these large populations would be accumulating enormous numbers of mutations. And even if I conceded that maybe there was some type of near extinction event based on this volcanic eruption, I do want to go on record saying that there are a lot of scientists and experts in the field that agree that there are some inconsistencies with that volcanic eruption leading to the near extinction event. I would just have to probably provide those sources after. But even if I conceded that, I'm still looking for an answer as to how that hypothetical population could have exploded in all parts of the world, because based on the inbreeding, based on the extended bottleneck, the extended nature of it, it wasn't just one generation or 2 generations or even 10 generations. How did they seize dominion over the entire planet? They would have been so genetically compromised that this just is not feasible, other than storytelling.
So I'd ask, why would they be genetically compromised? What do you mean by that?
So the reason why they would be genetically compromised is because that population bottleneck would include enormous numbers of deleterious mutations going to fixation, because, as you know, inbreeding exposes the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. So if there's an extended near extinction event for, say, hundreds of generations or just many generations in general, the resulting inbreeding would cause permanent and severe genetic damage. And yet we're supposed to believe that 70,000 years ago, this genetically compromised population of Homo sapiens suddenly exploded into all parts of the world, thus seizing dominion over the world. I mean, it's not feasible. I mean, we would need some type of explanation for how that could be possible.
Well, I don't understand where you're getting this information from. Like, why would the genome just build up one by one different, like, single nucleotide changes or whatever the mutation may be, and then just continuously get worse and worse until those things get fixed? I'm not really following your logic there.
Are you disagreeing with the fact that evolutionary bottleneck hypothesis does involve an extended and lengthy near extinction event, and thus resulting in severe inbreeding and genetic damage. I mean, that's just the nature of bottlenecks and inbreeding. Look at the cheetahs today. I just looked it up the other day, and the cheetahs are now down to like 7,000 because they are inbreeding. They have experienced a genetic bottleneck as well. Their sperm is degenerate. Many recessive mutations are coming to the forefront. I mean, conservationists are looking at them and they're seriously concerned that this population of cheetahs are going to go extinct. I mean, it's a very serious problem, but I don't see these cheetahs being in such a compromised state, suddenly exploding into all parts of the world, seizing dominion over the world. But that's what you're trying to say happened 70,000 years ago with this hypothetical population of 10,000 Homo sapiens. So if we see today that this leads to severe genetic damage, how is this remotely feasible other than, ad hoc, post hoc storytelling, of course?
I think it requires storytelling. I mean, cheetahs, I think we can kind of set them aside because different animal, different types of environment, different types of environmental pressures than humans would have. So a separate topic, interesting topic, but a separate one. As far as the buildup of deleterious mutations, there's lots of ways for you not to get just some like linear buildup. It's all bad, and then it's going to end up in some homogenized state where the species goes extinct.
Well, I understand what you're saying there. I think that more so has to do with long-term genetic degeneration, like, for example, genetic entropy, which we can get into, right? We accumulate 100 new mutations per person per generation. I understand that, we could argue all day as to how many of those are completely neutral, how many of those are beneficial. But when it comes to the population bottleneck story, we're just simply talking about the result of inbreeding, right? Because I always say that inbreeding, it's like a sneak preview of where we are going genetically as a species. I mean, that's why the reduced life expectancy of, say, inbred children, well, that's reflecting the overall aging of the genome, because what's happening is the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes, they're being revealed, the ones that have been accumulating over time. So this small population of, say, 10,000, some believe 2,000, and I definitely don't want to beat a dead horse, but I've never personally received a good answer as to how a genetically compromised population such as that, which I believe correlates perfectly with the highly degenerate population of cheetahs we see today, could have actually exploded into all the world and then seize dominion over the planet, right? I mean, some say they assimilated with the Neanderthals and Denisovans and the other so-called human species. Others say that they killed them off, right? Like I said, there's different theories, multi-regional, out of Africa. So I just see stories coming from the evolutionists, and I think we might just have to agree to disagree on that. I'll just have to say I don't think you sufficiently answered the question regarding the hypothetical, population bottleneck of 10,000. I mean, there's just no feasible way that such a genetically compromised population due to the inbreeding. Because I think you're more so addressing long-term degeneration, right? And we can shift to that, because one thing you did say that I did take note of is that selection happens and on the phenotype, right? Because selection, would you agree selection happens on the level of the whole organism, right? Like, does selection act on phenotype or genotype?
It acts on phenotype, but you need to adjust what your definition of phenotype is. It's not just the morphology of the creature that we're describing, or of the life form that we're describing. It's also deeper than that. So on the molecular level, it's the proteins. The proteins are also that get expressed are also part of that phenotype.
But one single point mutation on, say, a single nucleotide, if it's not harmful enough for selection to see, then selection is not going to act on it, is my point, right? It has to be phenotype ultimately that selection acts upon. That's why my position is that selection acts on the best beneficial mutations, right? We can talk all day about beneficial mutations that say add new novel information to the genome, for example, or we can talk about the worst detrimental mutations, because then natural selection, of course, they can rid the population of the most deleterious of mutations. But my position is that selection cannot stop the loss of information that's actually immeasurably small due to the low impact mutation accumulation, because as you said, that's actually happening on the molecular level, right? So even if, let's say, even if only 10 of those 100 new mutations per person per generation were deleterious and the other 90 were completely neutral, that alone is still too much for long-term genetic advancement. I mean, there's got to be a type of selection that can select away such low impact mutation. And I understand there's redundancy in the genome, and I understand the things that you're saying. There are mechanisms, right? Synergistic epistasis, the cryptic variants that you're talking about. But ultimately, there's still a percentage of those 100 new mutations that are deleterious. So what type of selection is going to rid the population of those ones, I guess, would be my question, Aaron.
Just to clarify, so Standing, your objection is that if there was a population bottleneck of 10,000, then that would create too much similarity in the genome to be able to repopulate the Earth. Is that your argument?
Right. It would be like the cheetahs that we see today. They're so genetically compromised due to the inbreeding. They're so genetically similar. There's too many recessive mutations that have come to the forefront. And that's exactly what would have happened in the population bottleneck. I believe they say it's about 70,000 years ago. There'd be prolonged inbreeding. And so in that specific case, it's the inbreeding that's the problem. And we can see a reflection of that in the cheetahs today. I mean, they were at 10,000 at one point. I just looked it up the other day. They're now down to 7,000. You know, like conservationists are extremely worried about the
what was the lowest the population of cheetahs ever got?
Right now I believe is the lowest. It's at at 7,000.
At the bottleneck that accounts for the homogeneity they have today, like what was the number of individuals?
Right. Good question. I believe that it's similar to the population bottleneck of humans, right? There's some that say 2,000, 10,000. I've heard some papers that describe them as 30,000, because all they're doing is they're looking at the genetic data. They're looking at the limited genetic homogeneity, and they are coming up
genome size compared to the human genome size.
So we have 3 billion letters. Obviously, mom passes on 3 billion, dad passes on 3 billion, so 6 billion letters. Are you asking how many DNA letters are in the cheetah?
How many genes that are expressed in cheetahs versus, I think humans have around 21 to 25,000 genes.
Right.
What's the number in cheetahs?
Right, non-coding versus protein coding. I'm not sure how many are in cheetahs. Do you know?
I don't know, but I think that would be...
I got a question for you. So, as far as I know, cheetahs don't intermingle much. They have very close-knit packs, and which is why their genetic deterioration is so much greater, even though they still have a population which would potentially be able to support genetic growth.
Yeah, it's like inbreeding within inbreeding. So
right. So the problem is that they're like in little subgroups, and they're not really diversified in the 7,000 that do exist, which is the problem.
Well, and that's an interesting point too, Tom, because a lot of papers that I have read too is that there would have been subgroups very similar to the cheetah subgroups that we see today in that hypothetical population of 10,000 Homo sapiens 70,000 years ago. It's a very, very similar population bottleneck to what we see in the cheetahs. And I'm not saying that they would have went extinct right away, but we're not going to be seeing these 7,000 cheetahs that are incredibly genetically compromised suddenly seize dominion over the entire planet, like supposedly the 10,000 Homo sapiens 70,000 years ago did.